After an extended absence, I'm back with more 3D nonsense. But before we get started, hello, I'm Kat, and I like to design and 3D model stuff. I was gone for a little bit for personal reasons. I'll probably get into it at some point, but I am so ready to get started on making more new silly shit. And hopefully this month I'll have 2 new videos up for you instead of just the one. This one is a late one from last month that I wasn't able to finish in time. If you're a Patreon girly, you will know why. Anyway, for this quarter, I wanted to focus on one of my favorite properties, Discworld. I've been a big fan of Sir Terry's work since I was 16, and soul music, the work I'm drawing from for this autumnal season, is one of my all-time faves. If you're not familiar with the works, they're a satirical sci-fi fantasy, written with a silly and punny sort of voice that often tackle quite serious subjects, like complex geopolitics, the degradation of fidelity in news media, gender, and gun violence. This one in particular is about change and the lengths that some will go to preserve their existence, death and loss, and rock music in a fantasy context. It doesn't seem like it would fit, but it really does. It's a decent entry point if you're curious about the series, but it wouldn't be my first choice to recommend to new readers. Suffice it to say, I will be discussing the book and its characters a fair bit. I'll try to keep away from spoilers, but this isn't one of the more plot-twisty books in the series, so anything I touch on will likely be something that happens early on enough that I wouldn't feel too bad about mentioning it. It's the story of the band with rocks in, the wizard shenanigans kind of surrounding it and peripheral to it, and Susan Stow-Hewitt's family drama. And today I'm kicking things off with the main singer and guitarist of the band with rocks in, one Imp Y Celyn, or Bud of Holly. Now, Discworld as a whole tends not to describe the characters in too much detail. We're just given enough to know that the character is, for instance, a young man of like 20-ish. He's a classical lutist from Fantasy Wales, or Lemedos for the fans in the audience, and he's mentioned to have a slightly elven quality to him. He seems a bit magical, at least to his dwarvish bandmate Glod Glodson, although whether or not it's an intrinsic value or just Glod being a little bit xenophobic is kind of left up to the reader. The omniscient third-person POV does kind of mention it at the very end, but it's no more than just a slight mention. So what do we know? He's a Welsh lutist who kind of gives Fae vibes, and is maybe 20-ish or thereabouts. This kind of scant impression of him in the book has given us several fan-made character design interpretations since the first publication of soul music in the 90s, and most notably this one from the TV limited series adaptation in 1997. It's fine for what it is, which is a very dated TV adaptation from the 90s with like a £5 budget per episode, but I personally believe that we can do better. Let's dissect the choices made here. His original robes and hat are meant to signify his kind of druidic origins, but the eventual casual clothes that they put him in are really, really basic. Now, strictly speaking, Discworld is pretty loose with its historical period inspiration and aesthetics, but I always kind of got an early Edwardian energy, just a little bit post-Victorian with a bit of steampunk and magic, and this basic flowy flounce shirt and breeches doesn't really tell us anything about the image that the band is pushing, or what kind of energy he has when he's under the influence of the magical guitar that he acquires early on in the book. His hair is kind of limp and lifeless. As the show goes on, he starts to be drawn with like a half curly quiff that just doesn't look all that good at all. I can't see what they're going for. Like, this is some sort of a rural farm boy who is forced to fit a specific 1960s expression of rockstar masculinity, but the way it comes across in the artwork is just kind of half-assed to me. I think we can do better. Magic is involved, so we can use character design here to introduce this idea by using, for example, like an unnatural color in his hair. The book mentions his status as a little bit of a sex symbol once the band sort of gets going, and I'm so sorry, but this look does not communicate that at all, and it didn't in the 90s either. It looks like if Prince lost all of the fashion and cunty swagger that he was known for. This, as a decision, feels absolutely insane and targeted at me, because Prince was one of the hottest men alive at the time, and it just makes absolutely no sense to strip a character that has vague visual ties to him of all of that cunty sex appeal. So, no shade to Alistair Fell and Jonathan Webb, the character developers on the show, but let's maybe zhuzh this guy up a little bit. Let's make him a little cunty. You know, he deserves it. So now that I've set all of my issues up with his vibes and energy in the best known adaptation of this character, how am I going to presumably fix this? Well, to be honest, it kind of was a lot of work. To be honest, it took a bit to try and figure out how I wanted him to look. I was genuinely at a loss for a little while, trying to get to the energy of this design that I wanted, and how I wanted it to come across. This was my original idea, and it's a little bit of a complete disaster. The late Elizabethan trunk hose would be impractical given what his whole deal is, and the double-breasted vest design here kind of clashes pretty badly with it. I drafted this design in early September, and when it came time to model it 3 weeks later, I had to start over in disgust, because this model was poorly communicated and confused. I redesigned it about a week ago after considering the vibe that I wanted, and came to something that makes a little bit more sense to me personally. I wanted a design that communicates the character's dynamic in terms of like what people perceive of him in the story, if not he himself, because, you know, once he gets magically animated by that guitar, he really doesn't have a lot of personality in him outside of I wanna create, I wanna only be doing music. But to the other characters outside of this dynamic, he has a very specific like vibe. I wanted to design a sort of controversial figure, a tastemaker, musician, a bit of a sex symbol, and someone who's like reshaping the culture a little bit, you know? Somebody with that kind of cachet. I've mentioned my age once or twice on this channel, so it will surprise absolutely no one that my immediate cultural touchstone for this kind of a character design is Infinity on High / Folia Do era Pete Wentz, bassist and lead lyricist / frontman of the band Fall Out Boy, creative director of like Clandestine Industries. If you're somebody who used to listen to their music a lot in like the 2000s, you will know what that is. And by extension, kind of Gerard Way as well. I think specifically the brand of like creative director for a movement that just sort of happened. Haunted-eyed, I'm a slave to my creativity and music kind of vibe is very appropriate for our guy Imp. The outfit is a bit more inspired by V from Devil May Cry, with the open vest with tails and sort of nondescript but still kind of tailored pants. The long and slightly artfully disheveled hair was also kind of a nod to this concept as well. I gave him a couple accessories here and there, just to really sell the rock star vibe of the fit, and sort of hint at his connection to death with this like slutty little skull choker. He also just has very normal guy boots that everyone in Discworld wears, just to kind of nod at the fact that he's a little bit of an everyman. His circumstances have made him more than this, but he's kind of just a normal guy at heart. Now that we've thoroughly discussed his look and design, let's start modeling. We start off with this basic subdivided mirrored box that I always do, but controversially this time I do a second subdiv modifier as well instead of just modeling it straight from there. It's rare that I do it this way because it slows everything down a little bit, but I think for this project it was kind of necessary. It was really hard for me to get the face shape correct otherwise. As usual, it's a lot of pushing and pulling of vertices, getting the shapes right with the reference images without making them look too fucked in 3D. I end up having to redo the nose because it just doesn't look right to me, and in all honesty, I don't love the end result 1,000,000%, but it's better than the original version that I did. This was kind of a difficult one. I've sort of taken to doing transparent textured meshes for certain hair areas like lashes, brows, and body hair. I think it really hit for this project because I actually hand-rigged the faces this time for extra animation control, and that made it much easier to like get eyes closed without it being like a whole production, essentially. I'll be expanding on this later. I just wanted to quickly point out this is why I extended out from the eyelid mesh instead of just doing my usual big chunky lash line.
But we do, don't we? You and me. Look after me. I've got an appointment.
I did the brows the way I usually do though, just a separate plain mesh, mirrored and subdivided and extruded around the forehead. I had to fix the bottom of the head before I could begin extruding it to be a neck and a body, because it was simply too nasty this time to just immediately start off as the bottom base mesh. You guys have seen me do this a million times by now, I'm sure. Extrude down from the base of the head to the chest and neck following the lines of the sketch. I actually kept the bottom open for this and only closed the crotch bit when I got to that part of the sketch because it streamlines that process a bit for me. I think I'll keep doing it this way going forward. Now I'm just shaping the crotch and leg hole area to get a nicer shape for the legs. I also start refining the chest and shoulders here, adding a little bit more meat and shape to the arms and chest. He holds his guitar up physically, like instead of having a strap in my design, so he'd have to be pretty ripped from holding it up all the time. To better support arm deformations, I added a couple more edges around the elbow in the front and back, joining up some edges and insetting the faces slightly. This will help the elbows look more natural and a lot less fucked up when it's time to animate. To create the tits, it's an inset around the base where the tit should go, and then just futzing it into the right shape and location in sculpt mode. You've seen me do these legs a billion times by now. I duplicate the leg hole and situate the edge where it needs to be in accordance with the reference images, right at the top of the leg but beneath the butt cheek of the reference image. I did the same thing with the knees as I did with the elbows, creating that defined set of faces for the patella before closing up that big hole around the hips and ass by filling in the faces one by one. I've sort of just stopped modeling feet unless I really have to, like if the base mesh will likely have their toes exposed. So this model just continues the trend of me only modeling the shoes instead of fussing with feet. Maybe I'll go back and get really good at it someday, but right now I'm okay with not really focusing on that. I add a base plane here that I'll be loop cutting a few times and shaping into a rough boot base shape before I extrude and expand upwards to meet the ankle and shin bone. I do the toe box and shin separately to really emphasize the shape difference, and from there just refine all the different shapes of the boots here, insetting the bits in the middle to create a lip for the outer part of the shoe and creating a shape for the tongue of the boot. I then extend the mouth of the boot outward and down just to give it that floppy sort of period overhang, you know? That like little floppy bit around the front and sides. I really love that about old boots. I think that like as a fantasy thing, that's just a really fun design element. So I do that with like every fantasy design that I make. Then it's just futzing with the shape and the scale so they fit the new model better and aren't too tiny. Now we can start copying bits of the base mesh for the clothing. I do the pants first and then the vest, refining the shapes after I separate them into their own objects. For the vest, I pull the front edges down into a V shape and give him that low V neck hole to show off his chest, and extend the tails downward to his shins, adding loop cuts for better topology and flow for animation.
When spring has returned and
With that done, I apply the mirror mod and begin adding a front panel and back panel to give it that double-breasted detail, and then I extrude outwards around the collar to create his huge standing lapels that I added to this design.
on dark lonely nights when a cruel wind has blown, with a rhubarb companion you're never alone. Rhubarb in crumble, rhubarb in pie, or as strudel will do till you transmogrify. Gathering rhubarb from field and from hill, we'll be gathering rhubarb till we've had our fill. Gathering
I'm not really sure why I waited till now to do the hands, but they're your basic subdivided cube hands that I do for every model. I'm just extruding each finger and correcting topology where necessary to keep stuff clean and functional for the armature. I also add some extra definition around the leftmost and rightmost edges of the bottom of the hand for those bits of the palm that are more protuberant and squishy, like around the bottom of the thumb here and the bottom of the pinky as well, before extruding the thumb outwards. Once that's all cleaned up and made nice, I join this mesh up with the body and close the gaps between the edge of the wrist and the top of the hand that I just modeled.
So firm to the touch, can bring so much happiness when firm in your clutch. 'Tis a friend of young maidens, 'tis a friend of all thrones. With a rhubarb companion, they're never alone. Gathering rhubarb from
With the hands all done and the wristband all fitted, I start adding detail to the pants by applying the mirror mod and cutting through the mesh with the knife tool, deleting faces but still keeping the meshes and topology clean. To make the skull pendant thing, I added a new plane with a mirror mod and began creating a round shape with a sharp extruded edge for the teeth. I cut into this lower extrusion using the knife tool and created new edges with the resulting vertices to keep the topology clean again. I added eyes by insetting the faces around the middle of the shape and moving everything around until it looked right, and then deleting the faces inside. Once I finished the nose, I extruded the whole shape outwards and filled the back faces of the eye holes in the nose back in. Then I added 3 toruses, shrank all 3 down, and fit them to the size and the shape of the collar, so it sits neatly between the tops of his pecs, right around up here. I futzed a little bit with different stud shapes for his bracelet before settling on just a plain cone spike that I then copied around his bracelet. To make his buttons, I created a circle and began to extrude mesh outward to create a dome shape with a flat bottom. I made it really tiny and copied it like 5 times, situating it right at the overlap of the vest to help sell the double-breasted style a little bit more. His belt is just a plain extruded around the hips unevenly to give it some more artfully incorporated sag and organicness to the shape language. A lot of this design reads as symmetrical on first glance, even if it isn't strictly speaking, and I wanted to balance that out with elements like the belt and bracelet and hair that are very obviously not symmetrical and didn't start out that way. To help create the PC emo shapes in his hair, I edited several curve circles into different shapes and used them as the basis for the curved hair that I'm going to do for him. I did some symmetrical layers around the bottom that will have very limited movement, but the upper layer has little to no mirroring because it's an aggressive emo side part, and I'm setting it up for a very involved hair rig. With the model all finished, I converted my hair objects to meshes and joined the mirrored ones with each other. The two objects that weren't mirrored were also joined together for ease of weight painting. And that's the modeling all done. Now let's hop into making that skeleton. Started off how I always do, with a basic human meta rig with all its facial features removed. I plan on building these back in now that I kind of know how, so I'll just skim over all the normal stuff. You know how to situate your armature into the model by now, I'm sure. Once I've finished creating his hair armature, it's time to work on the eye rig. I start by adding individual bones in the mesh around his brow bone. I did 5 here, but 4 is also fine. Each bone will be a manipulable point for fine-tuning and expression for animation. Do the same for his eyelids, making sure you're labeling each as you go. Very important to keep stuff labeled. I did 6 per eyelid for better control. Then, to take a break from the eyes, I did the same thing for the mouth and the lips. Most of my models this month actually have this kind of facial rigging because they're a band and they all make, expressions while they're playing. I wanted them to be very expressive. For example, Glaud's model also has cheek controls because he's a hornist. He has to be able to puff his cheeks out real big. So I've done a lot of extra work this month on specifically being able to control the faces. I just added several bones to the upper and lower lips, and the direction of each bone is super important. So remember that your upper lip / eyelid bones have all the skinny ends facing up, and the lower lip / eyelid bones all have skinny ends facing down. After adding some extra bones to the clothing and accessories, I'm hopping back into the eyes to finish the process. I added another bone here, and this one goes directly into the eye socket instead of just around it to control the direction the eye is looking. These will follow their own little rig, so I'm making that next by adding 3 more bones. The rig control bone in the middle, which is upright, and the 2 eye control bones, which have the same orientation and height as the original eye bones that are inside the mesh. These ones are just outside as opposed to inside. These will control the gaze direction. I then add 2, one facing up and one facing down, to control the general position of the eyelids. Finer tweaks can be made using each separate bone, but these control the general open or closedness of the eyes. This basically makes it so that they can blink or squint or whatever have you. Now the eye bones have to be given a damp track bone constraint. Target the rig, and in the bone field put the eye control bone outside the mesh. These will now follow whatever those outside bones are doing, so you can have them both move a bit more naturalistically. Add that damp track to both the eye control bones to have it follow the main eye control bone. I'm gonna be saying eye control bone a lot, so sorry. Now that that's done, we're adding a copy location constraint onto every upper and lower lid bone. Make sure to have the bone target be the upper lid control for all the upper lid bones, and the lower lid target control for all the lower lid bones for each side. Make sure to tick the offset box here and target local space to make sure the owner is also set to local space. This will make it so that the bones aren't like freaking out when it comes time to pose and weight paint. All of this is set up so that when the controls move around, there's movement in the eyelids too. It helps add realistic dimension to the animation of the eyelids, which can be super difficult to do with any fidelity. Once all this is parented to the head bone, you can symmetrize all of these bones. Make sure to copy the bone locations to the appropriate side controller bones so they're properly controlled. You can see me here sort of freaking out because the rig is in a rest pose, but it still looks off. It's because I hadn't set all of the rig transforms when it was in object mode, so the rig was technically outside of its natural location and scale. Make sure to hit Ctrl A to confirm all transforms so this doesn't happen to you. Once that's fixed, you can parent everything and start manually fixing your weight paint. It's especially important to do this around the eyes, because you don't want the cheeks or the brow ridge or the nose to move too much when your guy is blinking. Then it's kind of just about cleaning up the vertex groups and making sure that stuff that shouldn't be targeted by certain bones isn't being targeted by those bones. Here you can see me manually working on the eye rig and making sure it deforms nicely with the weight that I painted manually. Now it's time to do that with all of the hair. This can take some time to get right because you have to keep manually revealing and hiding layers of hair to make sure that you have the right stuff painted, but if you keep stuff labeled neatly and separately into bone groups, it'll be much easier. I just go through these hair strands separately and make sure everything is weighted properly so it moves nicely and isn't influenced by the wrong bones. I'm being really fastidious about this because I like to add physics, and it can really fuck it up if the weight isn't perfectly distributed and isolated.
Reach out.
With all of that done, it's time to correct the weights on the clothes. This usually goes a lot faster. You just need to make sure the body mesh doesn't clip out too aggressively all the time. Make sure you're posing the body a lot to get an idea of the problem areas, and make sure you're only painting where you want to be painting. I didn't bother to get too deep in the weeds with the legs on this, because the pants are meant to be distressed anyway, so a bit of clipping is fine so long as it isn't too egregious. With that, we're done with the rigging and can now work on the texture painting. First things first, add seams to everything so that it all lies flat and can be painted without too much overlap or trouble.
sun slipped down behind the shadow of the mountain. A giant wave of sound drew us towards the source of her power. The darkness was frightening.
Once that's done, I can find the biggest issues and move the islands around to fit the canvas better so it doesn't get too messy or overlap.
We had discovered the secret of her ascendance, and we knew we were in the presence of the touchstone.
Now I'm starting by adding some depth to the face. I deepened the complexion slightly here because the original shade was a little too pale, and I began to add shadows to add to that dimensionality. And now I'm just kind of adding shadows and highlights around the face to further encourage that dimensionality, further sort of push and pull that contrast so that it feels more like a face being hit by shadow. I like to do paint work like this manually instead of like waiting for the light to do that because I prefer to have more control over it personally, but that's very much up to you. Once the face has its base dimensionality, I add some darkness around the eye socket because he's emo and he needs to have that like really thick, smudgy eyeliner. I also gave him some definition around his lower lash line because his upper lashes were going to be defined and done separately, and it just didn't feel right for him not to have that lower set as well, even just a little.
I'm leaving, and I'm taking my harp with me.
You what?
You can't change my mind.
Don't talk nonsense, boy. What you need is a good day up in Granite.
I gave him some big brown eyes because he has big deer in the headlights energy in the book, and I love painting brown eyes, and that's not just because my own eyes in real life are brown. So now, to work on his lashes and brows, I gave them their own transparent texture, with the blend mode set to alpha blend and the shadows set to alpha hashed. Then I just started to paint them directly onto that transparent lash line. It took some time and finagling, and it's really not easy to do right off the bat, but once I had an idea of the shape of the lash, I got started painting it and it ended up with this fluffy 3D transparent lash. The brow was kind of a similar operation, but a lot more straightforward.
Doing, isn't it? That noise he was playing on a blasted organ last night.
I gave the hair an emissive texture so that there was little to no dimension but the highlights that I added to tie that whole design back into that 2007 era Pete Wentz vibe. I felt it added a little bit of extra magic to have that unnatural bright red hair color, but just at the crown and the tips to add a bit of dimension. It also just looked really good and helped me get a better idea of the color scheme I wanted going forward.
A box of music. My word.
I don't understand it, but it looks as though we can trap the music on a wire, and we can play it back anytime we want.
We don't want to trap it, Stibbons. We want to stop it.
But if you can trap the music in boxes, then you don't need musicians. No more troublesome unhygienic.
Texturing the body here was very straightforward, just adding shadows and highlights according to where they would naturally fall on a body exposed to light. I also added a bit of body blushing around the elbows and knees and fingertips, just because, you know, he's alive, he should have that. The program crashed here right as I was painting his nails, so I basically had to start from scratch on his body, but it wasn't a huge amount of time wasted. It's a bit of a blessing in disguise, actually, because I have a tendency to be a bit heavy-handed with the lighter shades, so it's good to be able to go back and see the problem areas and go over them again with a little bit more restraint, and really only use the light for highlights. Let me tell you, this vest was super fun to figure out. I painted the inner lining this bright pinkish red to orange ombre to match his highlights with little details around the deep purple fashion layer in that same bright red. I wanted to have some satin areas so there was node manipulation and area masking to get it to look nice. Full node explanations can be found on my Patreon. I'm not going to explain them here, but I did get it to a place where it looked good in the end.
Well, kick off your shoes. I'm breaking the news. You know your daddy won't like tonight. But I know I can tell just like a ring in the bell. There's a big moon shining bright. Everything's gonna be alright. Break all the rules that only made for fools. Mama, you and me seeing the light. Oh, honey, you're so sweet. I can't stop them.
I made my own version of the Clandestine Industries bark skull to give him that like little chest emblem, and did a cute little back print of his name just for some added detail. I then started adding shading to the fashion layer with a few shades of a slightly lighter magenta purple, just to give it a little bit of dimension. Everything else that we have to do up until the shoes was pretty much just shaded in darker, more neutral tones for added depth, or with lighter, more saturated tones for the highlights. The accessories were all done in the same way. I divided the shoes into 3 separate shade ranges: the dark soles, the contrasting light tongue, and the mid-tone sides of the shoe. Each bit was shaded separately and painted with a generous wash of highlights and lowlights in warm brown. And here's the full reveal. I think he turned out absolutely adorable. He's ready to play some music for the belligerent crowds of Ankh-Morpork and the rest of the disc, alongside his 2 buddies Cliff and Glod. You can get access to all 3 of the animation-ready models, as well as this incredibly sick printable prop over on my Patreon. Should be going live at the end of the month. Link in the description. Stay safe, stay frosty, and I'll see you all in a couple of weeks with another character design pipeline. I'll see you then. Bye!